When Isla Bryson was convicted of raping two women while known as Adam Graham, there was widespread outrage after she was sent to a female jail in January this year. A policy set in 2014 meant prisoners were sent to jails that matched their gender identity, regardless of the crimes they'd committed. Those rules changed in February, and no newly convicted trans prisoners with a history of violence against women would be housed in female jails.
Well, now in a further new policy, which will come into force in February next year, the Scottish Prison Service has decided that rule will remain in place unless in exceptional circumstances. Critics have called it subjective and open to loopholes. In January to March this year, there were 23 trans prisoners in Scotland. 19 were trans women. 7 of those were in female prisons. There were 4 trans men. 1 of those was in a male prison.
We will be discussing that in detail in a minute, but first, here's our Home Affairs correspondent, David Cowan.
The Prison Service began this process 4 years ago, but in February, a case at Glasgow High Court propelled the issue into the headlines. Isla Bryson, previously Adam Graham, had started to transition from male to female while awaiting trial for raping 2 women. When the jury returned guilty verdicts and the taxi home was replaced by a prison van, Prison Service policy sent Bryson to Cornton Vale, Scotland's jail for women. There was uproar, and Bryson was quickly moved to a male wing at the jail in Edinburgh. The service's new policy means the 31-year-old will stay there.
Those individuals who have a history of violence against women and girls and present a risk to women will no longer be placed on admission in the women's estate.
Trans prisoners represent 0.3% of the prison population. Earlier this year, there were 12 trans women in male prisons, 7 in female prisons. The service has reviewed where they're being held.
And I'm content that everyone who is a transgender individual is located in the prison which best suits the risk and needs profile.
11 months on from the Bryson controversy, Cornton Vale is no more, replaced by a new facility for women. The Prison Service says its new policy will place a far greater emphasis on risk assessment. Exceptions to the rule will only be made in the most exceptional circumstances. But critics say that by not closing the door altogether, the service has left female inmates in danger.
Now, there's no way of knowing if an individual presents no risk. All the time the SPS uses risk assessment for different types of prisoners, and quite often they get it wrong, and this is taking a gamble with the well-being of women in prison who are entitled to single-sex spaces.
In England and Wales, trans women who haven't had surgery are banned from women's prisons, although once again exceptions can be made. Some campaigners, including a former prison governor, want a blanket ban here.
What is an acceptable risk to women? Is it a 5% chance they'll be assaulted? Is it a 60% chance they'll be assaulted? And the fact that they're willing to take risks as women's safety at all is just unacceptable.
The Scottish Government says the policy will keep inmates and staff safe and protect the rights of transgender prisoners. The Prisons Inspectorate says it supports the underlying principles, but will monitor how it works in practice. Such is the controversy over this issue. They won't be alone in doing that.
Well, we're joined now by Rhona Hotchkiss, who you just saw there, who was once a governor of Scotland's female prison, Cornton Vale. She now runs Byra's Place, a sexual violence support service that was set up by the author J.K. Rowling. A very good evening to you, Rhona. Thank you for joining us. Just what are your initial thoughts then on this policy?
Well, when I first read it, it was just disappointment. The Scottish Prison Service are 5 years late bringing this policy out. And really, it's changed very, very little from their current policy. There are no real changes to what they were doing already. I honestly don't see what they were doing for 5 years, that they've just brought this out at the end of it.
Now, they say that what will happen now is that a prisoner's gender identity and any background will be thoroughly assessed, that there are risk management teams within each prison estate, and that will happen. Do you not have confidence in those teams, in their ability to assess where somebody should safely be?
I've got a lot of confidence in my former colleagues to do standard risk assessments, although no risk assessment process is perfect. However, this is a really political document. So at one point in this document, the Scottish Prison Service uses the phrase sex assigned at birth. There's no such thing. This is a politically driven, politically informed document, and I just don't trust it for that reason.
Well, is it not the case that they're just trying to respect people's gender identity and their right to identify as a different gender to the one that they were assigned at birth?
Yes, that's absolutely fine, respecting people's identity, but there's no such thing as assigning a sex. It's not even gender. Assigning a sex at birth. You're either male or female when you're born, and that's it. But if we can move past that. So this document felt to me as though it had been written by one person and then edited by another. So in the annex, which talks about a huge big long list of the ways that men can be violent towards women and abusive, it says that a transgender woman will not be eligible to be considered for admission or transfer to a women's prison if they've done all of this big long list of offences. But then it comes out with this bizarre and inexplicable thing of saying that they can be, if there's compelling evidence that they do not present an unacceptable risk of harm to those in the women's prison. And as you had me on film there saying, what's an acceptable risk when men are in women's prisons? What's acceptable? There is no level of acceptable risk when it comes to violent men who've been convicted of violence against women. Being put into a women's prison is totally unacceptable.
But are they not saying that if such a conviction existed, then that would change the decision being made?
No, they're not. They're saying that these people will not be put in a women's prison unless there is compelling evidence that they don't present an unacceptable risk. How can a man who's been convicted of violence towards women in the past ever present an acceptable risk? An acceptable risk isn't even defined, so we don't know what that means. Now, they must have had some example in their mind when they wrote this phrase down. So what was it? What is an acceptable risk of violence towards women from already proven violent men?
We are talking about a small number of cases of people at the moment. There are 23 currently transgender prisoners in the estate from January to March this year. What do you think could be a solution here? Do you, for example, support separate transgender wings within the prison estate for transgender prisoners?
Well, Theresa Medhurst said earlier today, and I agree with her, it's a difficult thing to do when the numbers are small, because you would have to hold them all in the one place, which isn't a great idea for any group of prisoners, taking them far away from home. And it would be very difficult to provide any kind of a decent regime for them. That said, that's exactly what the prison service has just done with the two new women's custody units. I'm not suggesting trans-identified men go there, but what I'm looking for is a blanket ban on any man going into a women's prison. Far less men who've already committed violence against women. The other group that are...
Could they not also be vulnerable, though, Rhona, within a male prison? If they were sent there, would that not make them vulnerable?
It may do, but the prison service is very good at dealing with vulnerable men already. There are lots of groups of men in prison who are vulnerable, either because of the offences they've committed or the people they've spoken out against or what they did before they came into prison. So police officers, prison officers, politicians, all vulnerable when they go into prison. People who've spoken out against serious and organised crime gangs, vulnerable. Gay men, vulnerable. And yet the Scottish Prison Service manages to protect these people.
Very briefly, the Prisons Inspectorate said today that it supports the underlying principles but will monitor this. There are supporters and there are those against this new policy. What do you think ultimately is going to happen here?
I fear that this will be it for another 5 years. I hope it's not. I want politicians to say this isn't good enough. Humza Yousaf, back in January, described Isla Bryson as a chancer and at it. Now, under this policy, Isla Bryson could still be transferred to a women's prison. Furthermore, I noticed in your introduction, you still refer to Isla Bryson as she, even though Humza Yousaf has said he's at it and he's a chancer. And I want to ask when the media are going to be brave enough to stop calling people like Isla Bryson, Adam Graham, she.
OK, well, I think that was the BBC following the lead of the judge in that case. But Rhona, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you for joining us tonight on The Nine. We're grateful for your time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.